so I know exactly what you're all thinking. 1 hour to go until free beer. Just get this hour out of the way. I don't care what this guy says. I'm just thinking about the free beer. So I'm either going to entertain you, I'm going to put you to sleep. Either way, this hour's going to go really quick. So how can we make time pass quickly? Who likes quizzes? Quizzes make time go quickly, right? So first question, if there's one person in the DDD community you don't want to upset, who would it be? Greg? No, that's not who I was thinking. Second guess. Eric, exactly. Second question, who is the one person I upset at DDD EU this year? Eric. I said a few things about bounded contexts, and he kind of got a bit upset about it. So I've got two objectives today. We need to get through this hour quickly, and I need to not offend any people in the DDD community. Okay? So in order to do that, I'm going to say something nice on behalf of Matthias, so we can make jokes about him because he's not here. So, Domain-Driven Design Europe, best conference I went to this year. If you haven't bought your ticket, buy it now. Honestly, best conference. I'm not just saying that so we can pick on Matthias. It's not all about that. It really is an amazing conference. So, this isn't a joke about Matthias. This is true. Developers, you are all evolving. You wonderful little creatures. You are evolving. So back in 20 years ago, back in the 90s, worked on these big multi-year waterfall projects. The whole company would hope and pray that after this big project, the end result will be a product that somebody liked. It usually wasn't. Project usually failed anyway. And as programmers, we sat in the basement, chipping away at the keyboard, not talking to anyone, grunting like cavemen. Actually, Marco looked a bit like that last night at the speaker's dinner. Oh, I've upset him now, first one. So, yeah, then we got professional, though. We really did get professional. We stopped grunting, we started talking to people, and we started inventing things like Agile. It was developers who invented Agile. Like, business ruined it, but we invented it. So, yeah, we started helping businesses to iterate quicker. It was us who enabled that to happen. We made software development more professional. So we evolved, and we're still evolving, because now we're seeing another evolution. We can't just be professional developers. We're expected to be superheroes. It's not a joke. We're not just iterating very quickly and helping our organizations move fast. We are now the ones who are actually shaping the products, driving the product roadmap. And over the coming years, this is going to become more and more prevalent. And this will be the software developer of the future. Not just a coder, someone who's product-focused. And if you don't believe me, ask Marty Kagan. Does anyone here know who Marty Kagan is? Right, that's a lot of homework for you people. So Marty Kagan, really famous guy. He's one of the most famous product people in the world. Worked with some big companies in Silicon Valley. He gets invited to startups and companies all over the world to see how they're innovating. And what he's saying is, I'm seeing these teams that are good and they're different. Why are these teams different? It's because their developers are getting involved in the product and innovating. That's what he's saying the difference is between good teams and great teams. And that's a trend we're going to see carrying forward into the future. But when I tell companies this, I'm like, are you letting your developers innovate? How many items in your backlog were inspired by developers? Oh no, those developer people, they're not innovative. They're just Stone Age prehistoric cavemen or cavewomen. People don't think we're innovative. People don't think we can be creative. We don't even think it ourselves. Like me and Sophie, we run a workshop, and in the workshop, we form into these teams. We're doing this workshop tomorrow, by the way. Don't know if there are any spaces left, but if there are, sign up for it. So we form into teams, every team picks a business, and then, we work through the business, modeling the domain, architecting the software. And there's always one village idiot, apart from me, there's always one village idiot who's got some stupid idea. And like at the last workshop, someone's like, we're going to do a flying cars business model. And the whole room started laughing. I'm like, that's not funny. That's actually a good thing. When we're being creative, we think it's a funny thing. We don't realize that's creativity. And if you don't believe me, that's their business model. And at the end of the day, they'd done this business model, they'd modeled the domain, they'd done this software architecture for the system, and it was amazing. And it all started by a stupid joke from someone trying to make me look stupid. Because we don't think we're creative, but we are. So, why do we need to be creative? And why do we need to become superheroes? And it's not because of Docker. So what Marty Kagan's talking about is the maturity in development of digital products. So product managers, product management, that skill has been maturing quite rapidly in the past 5 to 10 years. We've seen movements like the lean startup. And what they've worked out is, do you know what? If you talk to your customers, you build better products. The more you talk to your customers, the better your products will be. Secondly, let the team talk to the customers. Let them be creative. So this is what's driving it. It's not superhero developers just evolving. It's the whole way we build digital products. It needs us to be superheroes. That's how high-performance organizations innovate faster now. So what we're seeing is continuous discovery and delivery. Has anyone heard of this, or dual track agile, or any of those fancy words for it? 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. Is this like an auction? Who's next? So continuous discovery and delivery. What this means is, think about continuous delivery. Continuous delivery was state-of-the-art 10 years ago. Do you think companies just stopped 10 years ago and said, right, continuous delivery, we're perfect. We're not going to try and improve anymore. We're just perfect. No, they've moved on to continuous discovery and delivery. This ties back with customers being the #1 source of insights, back to what Marty Kagan's seeing. So what's happening now is we have one cross-functional product team, and that team does discovery and delivery. The developers are interacting with customers. Either developers are doing user research, or they're actually watching user research videos. And developers have the choice to say, and it's not just developers, it's the whole team. Developers have the choice to say, look, we can see customers have this problem. We want to put that problem on the delivery track, and we want to build it. But it's not just saying, oh, the customer wants this. It's understanding that the customer doesn't tell you what they want. They just tell you what they don't like, usually, and you have to work out what they do want. So it's not a case of customer wants this, developers say we'll build it. Customer moans about something, developers have to work out innovative ways to solve it, and they have the autonomy to do that. And one of my favorite examples of this is a talk I was at earlier this year by Melissa Perry at Craft Conference. She was saying, yeah, a lot of my clients, because she's a consultant, a lot of my clients, they're all doing the continuous discovery, getting their developers involved with user researchers. And one of my clients, they make farming software, and they send all of their developers to work on farms. Now that got me thinking in a big way. I was sitting there in this conference, and everything started to go blurry. I was like, what would happen if the DDD community went to work on a farm? So I started telling people about these ideas, and I told Matthias, and he's like, oh, wow, I've got to go model some farming domains. And here's what he did on a farm. He couldn't help himself. He was racing around on motorbikes with sheep. Why do you think he's not here today? Because he fell off and injured himself. True story. But it wasn't just Matthias. It was also Alberto. Because Alberto was recently in Manchester, And there were lots of farms in Manchester. And he was getting all excited with event storming. And he noticed a tractor. And he got a bit carried away and he crashed this tractor. So DDD people on farms, we need to be careful. But there's someone else. See, I was telling Sophie about, going to work on farms. And I think she took my comments about superhero developers a bit too seriously because she started trying to fly on a pig. Back in the real world, there's an amazing book I read about continuous discovery. Or it's not about continuous discovery, it's just about discovery. Has anyone read this? Yeah, so everyone who hasn't read this book, it's definitely worth putting on your list. It's not about continuous discovery, but it's about discovery in general. It's got nothing to do with Scrum. So this guy called Jake Knapp and a couple of his friends from Google Ventures, they go and work with startups and small businesses and help them build their products. And they're like, we're struggling, we need a process. And they created this 5-day process. You get a bunch of people together, you work out the biggest problem to solve, you create some prototypes, you test it with customers, all in just 1 week. So there's a lot of discovery activities in there that will help you understand continuous discovery if you're not familiar with it. But there's also an amazing story in this book. So one of the companies he went to work for is called Savioke. Has anyone heard of Savioke? So Savioke make robots. You know it. Okay, Savioke make robots. Guess what kind of robots they make? Robots for your hotel. Autonomous robots that deliver things to your hotel door. And so Jake went to Savioke, and they were saying, we've got these robots, we've done all the hard stuff, we've just got one massive problem. How should this thing behave? Should it have a face? Should it tell jokes? Should it play games with you? Should it sing? Should it dance? And I'm not going to give the surprise away of how the story ends, but they tested all of that in 1 week with real customers, and it's an amazing story. So 2 bits of homework. Marty Kagan, Continuous Discovery and Delivery, and Sprint Book. But I've kind of taken you on a bit of a detour here. So I want to try and get back to today's topic. So we're in this new world of continuous discovery and delivery. But organizations are struggling to get here because of the way their organizations are structured. We want to move fast, we want to move quickly, they say, and they're having meetings every 5 minutes because they've got 1 million dependencies between all their teams. This is the opportunity for the DDD community to show how DDD is not just about models in code, but you can use the strategic aspects of domain-driven design to model your organizations. And if this community doesn't step up and show how to do that, someone else will. So I want to show you some of the examples and techniques that I think you can use. But first, we need a recap on bounded contexts. So I've got to do this bit without offending Eric Evans. But no one's going to tell him anyway, right? So just going to give them a little makeover. I don't want to completely rehaul them or do anything crazy to them, but let's just take a step back. So domain-driven designs, this idea, we work in these big problem domains, but they're all complicated and messy with all of these concepts. We need a way to break them down into smaller contexts. But to do that, we need to find things that are related. Because if we just create arbitrary boundaries, we'll have dependencies between those boundaries, and we haven't really solved anything. So DDD says you find these things that change together. Now, what's interesting is if you find things that change together and you align your teams with them, those teams will own things that change together, and they'll have fewer dependencies. So that's the first step we need to take, using bounded context to model teams. So let me tell you about a story about a government agency who didn't do this. They had an architecture like this. This is my story. So I went to work in the UK government a few years ago. They're doing this big agile digital transformation, all that kind of stuff. So I started off in this new digital part of the organization. And it's been waterfall for 20 years, outsourcing to Capgemini, all that kind of stuff. First project was pretty easy. You've got this old website, you just need to give it a bit of a reskin. So for the first 4 or 5 months, got a few people together, taught them the basics of TDD. We were doing continuous discovery, lots of user research. And after 4 months, we were like quite a slick little team, well, 3 teams. And then we had to do a real project where you have to do real programming stuff, like talk to databases. And then we had to talk to these people in the enterprise IT department. And things got a bit difficult. Let me give you an example. Customers are complaining. So we're doing the continuous discovery. We're talking to our customers every single week. And the customers are saying, I like your service, but I can't register with your service. Your address field's 3 lines long, but my address is 5 lines long. And this is a government service where your login is based on your business's address. So that was kind of a big problem. But we're like, well, that's our job. We're programmers. We'll fix it. We'll add a couple more text boxes. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in a meeting with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 project managers to put a text box on a web page. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in a meeting with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 project managers to put a text box on a web page. 2 weeks later, cancelled. It's just too difficult. We can't get all of these people to work together. So, but I kind of knew this, and here's a real lesson to take away. You probably know this anyway, but you have to be patient with the agile transformation, the digital transformation, all that kind of stuff. And we were like, okay, we've lost this text box. It's not going to happen, but we have to be professional. We have to show them better ways of working. And so a few of the developers and myself, we started working on this document. It had like seductive architecture diagrams, value stream maps, and we just said, look, we can make things a lot easier if we make a few changes to the way we architect our systems and our teams. And a couple of days later, I got told there's going to be a big meeting next Friday about that document you sent. I was like, oh, wow. Didn't think it would be that easy to change like a rigid organization. All these agile consultants are just making it all up. Fast forward to the meeting, and I get there, and the head of IT, he sat at the end of like a big boardroom table. He's got a mean look on his face, but he's always got a mean look on his face. He's got his elbows on the table like he means business, but he's always got his elbows on the table like he means business. He's that kind of person. But anyway, I'm still hopeful. I'm hoping he's going to say something that fixes these problems. He's noticed our document, and he wants to fix it. He wants us to move faster with our continuous discovery and delivery. What does he say? What's that? I wish he did say that. What he actually said was, you programmers are too slow. We've bought a rules engine, a BPM system, so we don't need you programmers. Nice. I got a question for you, right? How many project managers does it take now to put a text box on a web page? Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's not even all of them. That's the simplified version. So how could we have fixed this? So again, we continued to try and fix these problems for a little while. And we just went back to basics with bounded context. Like, if we wanted to fix this, if we had the opportunity to fix this, how would we use DDD and bounded context to solve this problem? What do we know about bounded context? They're linguistic patterns, linguistic boundaries. So if we want to find concepts that are related and that change together, that have like cohesion, well, if we look at the way people talk about things and draw diagrams, words and phrases that are used together, it's probably a good chance they're related in some way. Expanding on this, what I found is, in a big domain, you get different kinds of domain experts. And that's a big clue. Oh, this domain expert cares about this bit of the system product domain. this domain expert cares about stuff over here. Kind of gives you clues and confirmation about your designs. And I've also noticed data. So if you've got data in one context and you want to change it, and you have to change 5 other contexts, and you're kind of doing that every week, yeah, that kind of suggests your designs might have a few problems. So what we found was we applied these rules, and we thought, OK, we've got a review context here. So the government agency was all about business property taxes. As a business, you log in, and you can say, I want to see the assessment about my property to work out how much tax I'm paying. So they can see things like, does it have air conditioning, how much floor space, how many car parking spaces do you have? And we also noticed in this review stage, there was also the ability to compare. I want to compare my assessment against that big factory over the road and see how much they're paying, because I might be paying too much. And we thought, is that two contexts, the looking and the comparing? And we found there was overlap. OK, we'll start off with a big review. We'll keep it all as one for now, and we might break it out later. So we were happy with that. And then we got on to resubmit. So a business can say, hang on a sec, you're saying I've got 1,000 car parking spaces. That's very interesting. I've got a small ice cream hut next to the beach. Why would I need 1,000 car parking spaces? So the language here was all about proposing amendments and changes, increase quantity, but that wasn't the official terminology. So again, we thought, yeah, review, resubmit. These seem like good boundaries, but there's a problem. In both of those contexts, we're still talking about property attributes, like floor space and car parks and air conditioning. How can that be a linguistic boundary if we've got this same concept in both of them? And this is a problem I see a lot. It's that there are two languages. Like bounded contexts have an internal language, which shouldn't be shared. But bounded contexts, they still have to talk to each other, so there's still some language that is carried across. And so we were happy with this. We've got these two contexts. Most of the language is encapsulated. There's a very small amount that transfers between them. OK, we move on to renegotiate. And this is where a business says, well, since I don't have 1,000 car parking spaces, I don't want to pay that much tax. I want to pay this much tax. So one of the things we noticed here was the domain expert was a different person. So in the resubmit and the review, it was a surveyor, someone who goes around to properties and, yeah, calculates all of your air conditioning, your floor space, etc. But in renegotiate, it was someone with a very different mentality and personality and skill set and knowledge who cared about government legislation, legal considerations. It was a different person. And I'll tell you something about our domain expert. So we were working with a surveyor. We had an ex-surveyor in our team. He was our domain expert. And he came into work one day, and he was not very happy. We were like, what's up? He's like, my wife keeps telling me I'm an ugly version of Quentin Tarantino. I'm like, what the We're like, mate, you look nothing like Quentin Tarantino. And then someone shouts, hey. One of the developers, the front-end developer, he's like, come over here. So we went over to his desk, and we were like looking at his computer, like, oh my gosh, you are an ugly version of Quentin Tarantino. He told me I could say that, he won't be offended. Anyway, back to this. We found this case management context because there was a case management team. So there must be a case management context, right? I'm not going to say it. But what we found was the data wasn't very cohesive. And nor were the rules. So we had some rules in resubmits about checking combinations. We also found out the case management team were implementing those rules because they didn't trust what got sent to them. And we noticed when the data changed, like adding a text box to a web page, it also had to be changed in the case management. Because any information the user supplies you, the caseworker has to see that. So case management is not a context, it was a user experience. That's what we found. So, bounded context. Pretty cool as an organization design tool, I think. You can't see that. So in my head, I call them autonomous contexts, because that's what they're all about to me, autonomy. Autonomy in the code and autonomy in the organization. But don't tell Eric. Please don't tell Eric you saw that. Like, there's a line through it, means I'm sorry. What was I going to say next? Oh yeah, so bounded context, really interesting. Autonomy, all that stuff. Actually, they're not that interesting. It's the way bounded contexts interact that's the interesting part I found. Because that tells you about the dynamics in your organization. So I think bounded contexts, the way bounded contexts interact, those are socio-technical patterns. Patterns that apply to software systems and the organizations that build them. And that's what we are. We are socio-technical modelers. The way we model our software has an impact on the organization. When we make changes to one, we're making changes to the other. So if we understand the relationships between our bounded contexts, and we align our teams, or we at least understand the different kinds of patterns and the effect that has on an organization, we can say, we're in this situation, this pattern applies to us. We can iterate faster if we design our organizations this way to align with the domain. But I want to give you an example, because I'm not explaining that very well. I just said that. So let's get to the first pattern. So going back to the government example, stable sequential process. So what we had here was a business process which had to follow a strict order. You do your review, you do your resubmit, and you do your renegotiate. But this is also stable. And what that means is we know, based on our analysis of the domain, history of the domain, we know that these boundaries, they're not likely to change. Because in this example, it's a government agency. Like, governments don't really change that much unless you elect Donald Trump. And hopefully that won't happen too much. But now we know the characteristics and the interactions between our bounded contexts. What does this tell us about the organization that will build them? So teams will likely to be long-lived. We can think about optimizing our teams for the long term. This might be a good team to take some apprentices and interns, because we know it's going to be a stable team. We probably don't want to hire contractors here if it's a long-lived team, or maybe we do, depending on some considerations. But we also know that if the boundaries are stable and we don't expect them to change, there's a good chance that there's going to be less work that requires multiple teams. So we can expect low coordination between those teams, not having lots of meetings all the time. But that's not a guarantee. Just you can hope for this. It's like an indicator that it might happen. And we can optimize for the autonomy. Because of this second factor, we can optimize for the autonomy of those individual teams. We don't need to be, for example, scrum of scrums. We don't need to be having regular meetings on a very strict basis with all of these teams because they're working together closely. But yeah, some work will always span multiple teams. We can't expect it never to happen. And then on the technical side, this pattern also gives us clues about our architecture. For example, if we know the boundaries are stable, if we think they're not likely to change, then it's kind of okay for teams to have more freedom with their tech choices. We know that this part of the model might not have to be relocated to here because the boundaries are stable. That's not an excuse to use Docker. What else? Oh yeah, we might want to prefer commands over events. If we know it's a sequential order, that might tell us commands are best here. We don't want to have multiple subscribers to an event, so it's just a sequential process. We should probably be using commands here. If we're not, let's just double check we're not using them for a good reason. But there's also the idea that we should pair program with our upstream and downstream neighbors, just so we do understand their model and we are prepared if changes do happen, because changes will happen probably. Next pattern is the enterprise discovery context. Who's ever tried to innovate in a startup? Who's ever tried to innovate in an enterprise? Who found it more difficult to innovate in the enterprise than the startup? Right, so I work at Salesforce. There's lots of big talk about innovation, but it's hard in a big company like Salesforce, because in a startup, you're often building a new product, but in an enterprise, you're building on top of your existing products. And what that often means is you might, so this is an example from Salesforce. The business had this great new idea. We want to change the way we do some digital advertising. I won't bore you with the details. But what we found was this new bit of the system, it required bits of responsibilities from different bounded contexts. But in this situation, in a discovery context, it's all about iterating very quickly to prove if this idea is good or not, and we can get rid of it. So what we did was we took some people from each team, and we created this short-term discovery context. But what this says to us is this is a short-term context. We don't expect it to live for very long. So we want to optimize for speed of discovery, and if that means the other 3 teams get slowed down, that might be okay. So we're not just saying we want autonomy and high speed everywhere. We're saying specifically the discovery context, that's the most important thing in the short term. Team will be short-lived, so you may want to pull different people from existing teams. You may want to hire contractors. Combine people from different teams. And after your discovery work has finished, you may find your boundaries are wrong. So you may want to form new teams. So what we found was we do this discovery. We've got different people from different teams, but we know the discovery context it's got overlap with multiple bounded contexts. So after the discovery, the business wants to scale up, and they want all 3 teams to be working on these new features. So we know the discovery context has to be broken down later back into those other bounded contexts. We have to be prepared for that. We don't, when we're in discovery, we either throw the thing away or we design it in a way that's modular and can be broken later. So that's what I just said, basically. And I just said that. Yeah, so I just said that too, basically. The contexts that were formed into the discovery, they're likely to grow after discovery, so you need to prepare for that. Does that mean more teams, growing your existing teams? This one. So I've spoken to a few companies about this, and what they're saying is, we're a big enterprise. We want to build a new discovery piece, do some MVPs and test ideas out, but all of our data, it's locked in some database down here, and we just can't get it up to your discovery context. So you have to try and find innovative ways to do that, and it can be messy, and you need to say to the business, look, we found a short-term way to get a subset of the data into our MVP. That's not a long-term solution. We need to invest in other ways to do that later. Another one I found is the partnership context. So I used to work in digital media, like streaming and downloading of music. And we had these 2 teams that were closely related. By design or by choice, it had nothing to do with me, but we had a search context and a catalog context, and they were both sharing a Solr database, Solr search engine as the database. It kind of worked. It was quite high traffic, but what we found is these 2 teams are tightly coupled. We have to make it clear that these 2 teams work in a partnership, because it's not possible for these 2 teams to work in their own direction. If search team tries to go one way and catalog team tries to go another way, and they've got competing goals, it's going to be painful because they have shared resources. So we need to understand that when we're planning the work, we have to make sure these 2 teams are aligned on their goals. I think I'm just going to say, I've said all this. So we expect higher coordination by dependencies in a partnership context rather than those outside it. We try to avoid competing initiatives. And also, this is interesting, so we prepare for team volatility. Wasn't much of an instance here, but if you've got a partnership context, you're kind of saying, we've got these two contexts, but we're not really sure if those boundaries are right. There's too much overlap between these two contexts, so the boundaries might change. The teams might change as you gain more insights, as you increase your domain knowledge. And what I've seen is a lot of people don't like this, but sometimes you have to create a shared backlog between multiple teams, but try and make it temporary. Again, because you've got these two things that are kind of tightly coupled, and you're saying we don't really understand our boundaries here, it might be a good idea if you've got a partnership context to have two teams in the partnership context using the same technologies. Because if you do have new insights, if you do find better boundaries, it's going to be easier to move things across if it's the same technology. Doesn't mean you have to, it's just a consideration. And as we start to understand these patterns better, we might realize, no, it doesn't matter. Yeah, so when you see a partnership context, there might be a shared database or some shared things. We don't want that, but, and importantly, I think, when I worked in that partnership context, we did lots of cross-team pairing. Once a month, we'd have people from each team switching, because we wanted to have people understanding both sides of the system. We wanted to actually decouple those teams. So by more people understanding both contexts, it now enabled those chances to happen. This is one I stole from Matthias. I saw one of his tweets recently. So the octopus context, you've got this one service that reaches out and strangles, well, it doesn't strangle, but yeah, kind of wraps itself around the other contexts. I wanted to put a different word here, but the Salesforce legal team said no. Yeah, and I can't really give too many clues away, but let's imagine you've got a request to delete all of your customers' data. How would you implement that in software? Well, you might have an octopus context. You might have this one service that goes out to all of your other services and says, delete all the data for this customer, delete all the data for this customer, and give me the response back, and I'll keep an audit trail. That's one of the designs we looked at. But what does this tell you? It tells you that you've now got one service, one context, and one team that need to reach out and touch the others. So if there's a change somewhere, you might have to have a lot of teams sitting together in a meeting room. You've got to understand those dependencies, and the progress might be slow. If all of those dependencies have different priorities and they're moving at different rates, rolling out those changes can be very slow. So that's something you need to expect. Again, coordinate across many teams. And as I said, it could get political. Who likes politics? No one likes politics. Wow, someone likes politics. Politics, man, thank you. What does this say about technology? So, one of the things we found is, one of the first ideas was this privacy system would expose a feed, and all of these services would subscribe to that feed, and they would, in their own time, delete the customer's data and send an acknowledgement back to the privacy center. But what that means is every single one of those services now needs to have its own queue or message bus or way of doing asynchronous communication. And if you're not that mature, if you don't have the easy to do that in your organization, you might want to try and move that into the octopus. Put as much complexity in there as you can to minimize the pain on those downstream clients. You might want to look at enterprise integration patterns. So what we're saying here is, if you know you've got a certain bounded context pattern, a socio-technical pattern, there might be related technical patterns. And what we're saying here is, you might say, we're doing an octopus. Should we consider process manager, scatter gather, and some of those other EIP patterns? So that's some of the patterns. But it's not always, they're not always there in your domain. You're not discovering the patterns. You don't discover your bounded contexts. You choose them. It's a design choice. There is no perfect model, as we all know. We create multiple models, and we try and find the best model. So when we're thinking about socio-technical systems, how do we choose the best model? This is part of the quiz, by the way. How do we choose the best model? Okay, I think everyone's fallen asleep. So I managed to, yeah, he went that way, okay. Pardon?
Define the best.
Well, that's what I'm asking you. How do we know which is the best model to choose, the best pattern?
Discover. Just try it
Huh?
out.
Event storming. Doesn't matter what the question is, the answer's event storming. Event storming is the correct answer, but there's also a second correct answer, which is flow. So we want to find the pattern that enables our teams to do continuous discovery and delivery. That's what this is all about, bringing it back to the start of the talk. High-performing organizations, continuous discovery and delivery. How can we choose the best pattern that enables teams to do continuous discovery and delivery with a minimum amount of meetings and the minimum amount of project managers? So, yeah, we need to start thinking about the system of work. And I think this might be one of the things Eric didn't like, I said. But we understand working in a domain. We're great at modeling domains. We're great at doing event storming, thanks to Alberto. And is it 50,000 now? Has it gone up? Has it gone up a bit in the last few days? So we've done 50,000 orange Post-it notes. We're good at modeling domains. We now need to say, OK, we need to start thinking about the system of work and aligning the domain and the system of work to increase flow. So this is where we learn about theory of constraints. Has anyone heard of theory of constraints? Anyone who's awake? OK, so this is a good thing. Quite a few people have heard of this, and it's important, because theory of constraints tells us if we want to make our organization more effective, if we want the performance to increase, we need to find the constraints. We don't want to fix every single problem in the organization. We want to fix the biggest problems that are holding us back the most. Now, caveats, theory of constraints comes from manufacturing in the 1980s, so it's not quite the perfect metaphor for us, but it kind of works. So, who can see some constraints here? Okay, so one of our goals is we want to minimize the amount of these things in our organization. But how do we do that? Because there's always going to be bottlenecks. No matter how you create your boundaries, there's always going to be dependencies. There's always going to be different project managers who say their priority is the most important. So how do we choose the best model with the bottlenecks and constraints that hurt us the least? We learn about the goal, and I've already said that. This is what I was going to say. So we look for those magical core domains. We find the part of the system with the highest value, and we make sure there are no bottlenecks on our core domains. Here is Mr. Core Domain himself. Thank you, Mr. Core Domain. That wasn't coordinated. That was completely spontaneous. Thank you. Loved it. So we find the core domains, and we make sure it's easy for our organization to do continuous discovery and delivery on the core domains. Now, this is where things get a bit controversial. I'm not really a fan of core domains, because core domains, supporting domains, and generic domains, it makes the world seem so simple. You're either one of these, it's one of these, or it's one of these. But I found the world is just too many shades of gray. For example, core domains can change. Who uses Slack? Right? The rest of you, you're not missing out. Who spends all of their life posting GIFs and emojis in Slack? Right? Who has had to delete Slack from their phone and their laptop because it's really starting to mess their head up? Yeah, so anyway, do you know how Slack started? Slack was created by a company who make video games, but the video games weren't very good. And they had this internal chat system, which is one of their supporting domains. And they're like, well, the video games aren't selling. The bank account's pretty low. We've got to think of something smart. And so I guess some smart person said, let's turn the chat system into a product. Here we are, a few years later, Slack is now worth $5 billion, and that's now the core domain. Although maybe that's the whole domain, and there are different core domains. So these core domains can change over time. And that's just one example where the concept of a core domain, the idea is right, the model is just too simple. But, whoops. So what I'm going to say is there's another way to look at core domains, and I think this innovation portfolio kind of works better for me. So I'm not saying get rid of core domains. I'm just saying understand that every product, every initiative goes through this stage in its life cycle. And even if something's not core now, it might be an important investment for the future. That doesn't mean we should ignore it and treat it as unimportant, because we might have the next Slack hidden away on someone's laptop, not waiting to be committed to GitHub or whatever. So in Explore, we want to look at patterns that enable discovery. So in Explore, we might say, OK, this initiative, this new idea, this is an idea the business wants to explore. We're not sure if it works or not, so we'll create a discovery context. Because it's still important, and so we're communicating that this is a discovery context. It's not making us billions of dollars a year, but it could do, and so we need to respect it and give it time and effort and treat it like a child or whatever. But then we get to exploit, and this is where a business says, OK, we've got this idea, we've tested it with customers, we want to scale it up. We want to add lots of new product features, lots of robust features, more different use cases and edge cases. Now we don't want a discovery context. We want to break that discovery context up and create multiple streams of work that individual teams can do autonomously, continuous discovery and delivery. I've not really thought about sustain and retire too much, but I probably should have working at Salesforce. So we're almost done now. I just want to quickly wrap this up and show you what you can do moving forward from here. So I honestly believe this, despite all of the bad jokes and the stories that didn't really make sense. I honestly, truly believe that in this new era of continuous discovery and delivery, domain-driven design, strategic domain-driven design, is probably the best tool we have for designing modern organizations. We understand the domain. We find the organic cohesion. We combine it with theory of constraints, and we start thinking about a system of work and a product innovation lifecycle. And we choose the patterns, or we look for the patterns that help us to achieve whichever phase of the product lifecycle we care about the most. And so I've got a couple of tips for you. Lean UX is an amazing book. So that I talked about, what was the other book? Sprint. I talked about Sprint. That's an amazing book. But Lean UX, that's the continuous discovery book. So if you're not familiar with continuous discovery, that is the way to get started. That is an amazing book, and I know you'll love it. But what I also want us to do is, like, you probably thought my patterns were rubbish. The octopus, the partnership context, that Nick Tune, he knows nothing about patterns. So my challenge to you is, do a better job than me. Look in your organizations and start looking for these socio-technical patterns and tell us. Write blog posts, talk at conferences. What pattern have you found? What organizational constraints or implications does that pattern have? What are the technical constraints and implementations? And how does that align with theory of constraints and system of work? And so, we've got 10 minutes, but I'm almost finished anyway. Beat you to that, Mr. Core. So I know what you're thinking, right? It's going to be really difficult to achieve all this. We're not organization designers, we're just coders, we're just modelers. What I would say to you is, think about that one person in the domain-driven design community, that one inspiration that we all look up to. Whenever you need some courage to think, I can be an organization designer, I really can be an organization designer, but you're finding it difficult in your organization, just think of that one person in the DDD community who inspires us all. Be like DDD Borat. Thank you.